This is Jonathan Yates with the University of Iowa. Welcome to the Politics of Sports. Every 4 years, the state of Iowa goes first in the country in voting for the next president. Every day of the year, the University of Iowa is #1 in recreation and sports management, because that's the way we roll in the 319. With us today to talk about politics and talk about sports is Senator Joel Bolkom. Senator Bolkom, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Great to be here, Jonathan.
So I think it's the first question. Let's begin with, how did you get started in politics?
Well, I had an opportunity back in the early 90s to run for the Johnson County Board of Supervisors. At that time, I was working at the Johnson County Health Department on environmental health issues, and an opening came available, and I decided to throw my hat in the ring as a Democratic candidate for county board, and I was lucky enough to win that election and then served for 6 years on the county board, and then had an opportunity when an open state Senate seat came available in Iowa City. I got encouraged to run for that back in 1998, which seems like a long time ago now, and I've served in the Senate for the last 19 years or so. But I'd been involved in some Democratic Party politics, some environmental advocacy. I'd worked for an organization working on aging issues with seniors, and so it just seemed like an important place to be involved.
What have you enjoyed most about being a state senator?
Being a state senator from Iowa City is a great job. I've got the great support, a lot of interesting issues here in Iowa City that I have the ability to go work on, and of course I meet a lot of interesting people, and probably the most rewarding part of this job is helping people that have problems with things related to the work of state government, whether it's a human service issue, a transportation issue, a tax issue. Do a lot of constituent work, and that's probably the most enjoyable part of the job.
Now, when I used to work in Capitol Hill, a friend of mine was chief of staff to a congressman from Idaho, and I asked him, I said, what's the constituent casework like from Idaho? I mean, that's an interesting state, and he thought about it for a second. He said, Nazis don't write their congressmen. Now, Iowa City is a highly educated, liberal area. What's the constituents' casework like from Iowa City?
Well, right now there's a lot of concerns about the privatizing of the state Medicaid program. The Medicaid program is kind of the safety net program for seniors and people with disabilities, children, and people that don't have health insurance provided by their employer. And we privatized it. Governor Reynolds decided that we should turn it over to these three private managed care companies to make profit on sick people. And so there's a lot of concerns about people getting cut off services, providers not being paid, providers laying off people because they aren't being paid. So a lot of email and calls about that from very vulnerable Iowans that need this support. So that's probably the biggest area of concern right now. We passed a fireworks bill earlier this year. For the first time, we've had fireworks for 50 years. Got a lot of email about people unhappy with explosions in their neighborhoods at 1 in the morning. So it kind of it depends on what's hot and what's not, but Medicaid is really probably the biggest concern people have. I also get been getting email about the issue of medical cannabis. A lot of people suffer in this state with debilitating medical conditions and would like access to cannabis as medicine. They take these other powerful drugs, opiates that are highly addictive in some cases, and so that's another issue I've gotten a lot of correspondence on.
Now, driving to the studio this morning, I heard on the car radio that the Summer Hawk free tuition program has been ended. What's that all about? Well,
the universities in the last year took a $30 million cut from the state legislature, and our three public universities largely work, especially in the undergraduate area, on the state appropriation to the institutions and tuition. And over the last 7 years, we've had the worst state funding and state support of our three public universities, including the University of Iowa. In the last year, we took a $30 million reduction. And so there's a lot of pressure, I think, on these institutions, especially the University of Iowa, to look at ways to save money and cut costs. And unfortunately, I think this is a fatality of the failure of the state legislature and the governor to adequately support higher education.
Now, you represent the University of Iowa. Do you see the students getting involved in politics at all?
There are a number of student organizations that are involved. Of course, we have the elected student leaders that are involved. We have the university Democrats, the university Republicans that come to the Capitol and lobby for, for affordable tuition and the like. But students could obviously always be more involved in these issues. That said, students are here to get an education. They're really busy. They might only be here temporarily. It's sometimes hard for them to see value in getting involved in the local political work. But the work of the General Assembly and who's appropriating money is directly related to what happens to tuition, and I think that's something students should pay more attention to, especially now.
Do students realize how much political power they have? I ask that because in an interview, Senator Schumer from New York said, the country's controlled by the Koch brothers and other massive corporate interests. But in an interview with Men's Journal magazine, Barney Frank, who was a very liberal member from Massachusetts, he said small-town America does not realize the political power they have, then if they get together, they can beat back and they can beat Wall Street and corporate America. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally do. I mean, I think the issues that most people care about are the majority issues, and that's making sure we have good public schools, affordable higher education, a healthcare safety net, safe streets, a good justice system, treating people with respect and having good civil rights laws. I think those are majority positions, and students, I think people in general and across the country, working people need to be paying more attention to these things, especially now as Congress looks to basically provide the largest heist of money from the middle class of this country to rich corporations and wealthy individuals. All that's going to be really bad for the country. And people need to wake up and recognize that their paycheck is going to be undermined by the Koch brothers and this GOP Congress, who seems to act more like a robot than real people.
Now, Representative Jim Leach, when he spoke to my class, he said he was stunned to find out that there were so many farm wives in Iowa who had voted for Trump. He thought they would be appalled by Trump's, attitude towards women. But when he talked to them, they said, our family farms are in LLCs. We studied Trump's tax proposals, and it benefits us the most. I mean, did it surprise you when Iowa went for Trump?
A little bit it did. I mean, I just think Trump fueled kind of this divisional rhetoric around immigrants, around people of color, and used a real emotional appeal, I think, to agitate people to support him. I think if people are most concerned about their paycheck, they've made a huge mistake in electing Donald Trump president. Donald Trump cares about himself and only himself, and he's been brought to us by billionaires and millionaires, and they want to raid the country's treasury, and that's what's going on right now. So I think people are confused about that. They got carried away with immigration and guns and those kinds of issues as their top of mind issues, when folks ought to be paying closer attention to their paychecks. The president is a liar. He's lied about virtually everything he said. He would be on a sex offender registry in most states. There's been more than a dozen claims of sexual harassment, including alleged rape. So I mean, the 2020 election can't get here soon enough so the country can make a correction.
But what would you say in terms of the 2020 election coming if you were to talk to that Iowa farm wife who voted for Trump, and she said, I hear you, Senator, I respect you, but the Dow just hit a record high of over 24,000. Housing starts are high, farms are sites. We're exporting beef to China for the first time in over a decade. Interest rates are low. You look at those numbers, like the country western song says, the stars may lie, but the numbers never do. I like those numbers from Donald Trump. What would you say to that?
Well, I think who's president has little to do with those numbers. Those numbers are those numbers. But you could say Barack Obama deserves credit for those numbers. Trump's only been in office now 11 months. And the stock market's is a much bigger deal to the companies than it is to the little people like us, right? President Trump's also talked about NAFTA and the TPP. Well, in Iowa, when you start talking about trade, you start talking about corn and soybeans. And our two U.S. senators just sent a letter to President Trump about NAFTA, because if Iowa corn farmers lose Mexico as a customer, because Mexico is actively looking at South America to supply its corn, it'll be devastating to Iowa farmers. And you could say, well, Trump talked about changing the TPP, not supporting the Trans-Pacific Trade Deal. Trump talked about during the campaign changing NAFTA. Everybody, all the farmers voted for Trump based on those two. Those are top priorities, having trade for Iowa farmers. And Trump said, I'm going to mess those deals up. They still voted for him. Now they're wringing their hands over, well, what's he doing? He's going to undermine our ability to sell corn and soybeans. So what do people want here? It's time for people to come out of the fog and recognize that this president is a liar. He cares only about himself, and he's doing great damage to the country. And we aren't, unless he gets impeached, then we've got 3 more years to deal with his programs. And
so he's sensing buyer remorse among people in Iowa who supported Trump.
I think a little bit. I mean, people are reluctant probably to say, I mean, all our congressional delegation, our U.S. senators fully support this liar and this alleged rapist at this point. They can't seem to say he's done anything wrong. Well, they'll say, I don't really agree with some things he says, which is really kind of this phony excuse. I think it's hard for people to say I made a mistake on Trump, but clearly, on the renewable fuel standard, he's mucked around with that, and on these trade agreements, they're a disaster for Iowa agriculture. And I think the record hasn't been written on how bad it could potentially be if Trump screws up NAFTA to the point where Iowa farmers lose their markets in Mexico to sell corn and beans. It'll be an absolute disaster for Iowa agriculture should that happen.
Now, one thing that's always interested me about politics and sports is all politicians love sports for all the right reasons. When we had, Representative Nielsen here. She said, I'm not the world's biggest football fan, but I can't wait for the new high school in my district so I can go to the game Friday night, fired up the devil eggs and casseroles and see everybody. But when I read the policy papers and the position papers, I never see anyone, coming out for sports or something new in sports. And as you just said about Trump's tax bill, it is vicious on college sports. For, it does away with ticket tax deductions, bond limits for building stadiums. There's going to be hits for endowment funds. There could be caps on coaches' salaries and other things' salaries. Why don't you think there's more of an emphasis on sports by elected officials?
Well, I'd just say in general, on those pieces, there's more broadly, I'd frame it, and not so much about sports. I'll come back to that, but it's kind of a war on higher education. It's not only about being able to bond for athletic facilities. It's also being able to bond for things like pharmacy buildings and medical research buildings that is making it hard. There is a war on these public institutions by the Koch brothers and these big private, all these rich people who would like to privatize the University of Iowa and get rid of any kind of federal support to help students come to the University of Iowa. When you had a Pew Trust poll late this summer that said 58% of Republicans actually thought that higher education was bad for the country. There's no surprise here that there are 10 things in this tax bill that are bad for higher education, including all our public universities across the country. That'd be all the Big Ten institutions that would be negatively affected by that, or Big 12. Name your conference, right? It makes no sense to undermine higher education. If you look at the research that's come out of public university campuses over more than 100 years, it has fueled all the inventions that the country and the world relies upon to make our lives what they are and to break the prosperity in this country. And if you break the backs of these research institutions by starving them for resources, making it harder for them to exist, you are going to undermine our prosperity for the foreseeable future in this country. And we're going to hand it over to the Chinese, the South Koreans, India, and the enterprises there that are going to spend the money on research and support higher education. The idea that somehow higher education is bad for the country is the most backward idea I've heard in a very long time. 58% of Republicans in a national poll said higher education is bad for this country.
Now, one of the topics we cover in my class is exactly that. Most university towns will vote Liberal Democrat.
Yep.
I mean, that's a fact. 30 state legislatures are Republican now. Do you see that daily in your job? Do you see those forces? How do you do to support Iowa City against the legislature?
I think things have changed. I mean, in Iowa and across the country, I think legislators for 150 years have invested in places like the University of Minnesota, the University of Iowa, Iowa State University. We have two major AAU research institutions here in Iowa. We're a small state, 3 million people. We have two major research institutions. The people of Iowa have invested generously for a very long time to have these two institutions do what they do. And I'd say in the last 5 or 6 years, the voices of the Koch brothers and these millionaires who want to privatize everything in society have taken over the Republican Party and have taken over the policymakers and their views of these institutions, where now we're going to be spiteful about the University of Iowa because we have more Democrats in Johnson County, Iowa, so we're not going to fund the universities like we should. So I mean, I think that's a new development. And it's happening across the country, as you point out. You know, we have like 30 states controlled by Republican legislatures, 30 Republican governors, and they're getting all the same talking points from the Koch brothers and these conservative research think tanks they have that are pushing out all this garbage about privatizing these institutions. It's bad for the country. It's bad for our economy. The idea that we're going to have, we need less college-educated folks. And I'm somebody that thinks we need a strong vocational training program in our high schools and our community colleges. We have lots of jobs that don't need college educations, but we have to have both.
So when you're talking about the University of Iowa, you're obviously talking about the state of Iowa.
Yeah.
So, you know, I do a lot of traveling in my job, and, you know, when I go out to Wyoming, there's 3 things that always let me know when I'm in Wyoming. When I'm driving north on the 25, right at the Wyoming border with Colorado, there's a herd of buffalo on a ranch. Second thing that tells me I'm in Wyoming, a lot of times you'll see trucks blown over from the high winds. And the third thing that always lets me know I'm in Wyoming, the local radio stations play a lot of songs by AC/DC and a lot of songs by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. What 3 things will let me know I'm in the state of Iowa?
Well, you're going to see corn and soybeans. If it's in the, let's say it's in the summer, you're going to see lots of corn and soybeans. You're going to see rivers that probably need more investment to clean them up. As you drive across I-80, you're going to drive across the Raccoon and the Des Moines rivers, the Iowa River, the Cedar River. You're going to see that.
World's largest truck stop.
You're going to see when you get, depending on which way you come in. If you come in from the west, you're going to have to drive all the way across this state to see the world's largest truck stop. And you know, if you stop at a rest area or you stop at a convenience store or at a truck stop, you're gonna meet some nice people. You're gonna meet people that are friendly, that are welcoming, that are willing to help if you've got a problem.
So what are those Iowa values in those friendly, welcoming people?
Yeah, I think the values are hard work, thriftiness, frugality. People want to get a good value here in Iowa. Sincerity, empathy. People care for one another in this state for the most part. And then I just think a friendly smile, how can I help if you need help?
So how do you see those Iowa values playing out in sports? Iowa State did well in football this year. University of Iowa did well. Wrestling here. So how do those Iowa values play out in so many great athletes?
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd say is, you know, working together. You know, Iowa's built by people working together, whether it was on the farm or in the factory or in city and town and on the countryside. And you know, obviously, football's a team sport, and you got to have people working together as a team to make progress. I think of those examples of our football teams. Are people putting aside maybe their own personal desire to get good statistics for the benefit of the team? And I think that we could probably take a lesson in our politics today here in Iowa from our sports teams in that regard. We're not seeing a lot of cooperation and working together in the legislature right now, or the governor. It's kind of a winner-take-all operation, where half the team sits on the bench and the other half of the team goes about trying to make the state a better place, and that doesn't work very well. We need everybody involved in a more bipartisan effort to find common ground. Certainly there are things that ideologically the Democrats, in this case the Democrats and Republicans, have some disagreement on, but most stuff we can find some common ground. And I think we could take a lesson from our sports teams in our politics today. Even in Washington, it's winner take all, my way or the highway. And you know, if half the team says we're going to go this direction and the other half of the team doesn't agree, you're going to have a failed operation. You're not going to do well.
In terms of the divisiveness in Des Moines, would there be any relationships you have that would surprise us with conservative Republicans who you work well with, or others?
Yeah, my political career started in the legislature in the minority, and when you're in the minority, you reach out to those in the majority who have the ability to pass laws and move things through committees. You figure out who to work on topics you agree on. You go find colleagues that agree on them on the other side of the aisle, and you work to get things done. And being in the majority, I've worked with people in the minority. This last year, I find myself back in the minority party, but worked with conservative members of the legislature on issues like passing a medical cannabis bill in a strongly bipartisan way, with the help and leadership of my Republican friends. There are a number of examples, I think, and frankly, most of the bills that go through the legislature have bipartisan support. The attention gets on those that don't, you know, the ones that we fight a little bit about or have disagreements about. Those make the headlines.
Now, I teach the politics of sports, as you came and talked about.
Yeah.
And today in my class, we're debating gambling. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court debates gambling on Monday. What's your position on gambling in Iowa? If the Supreme Court allows it and the state passes it, you could be betting on college games now. What's your position?
Yeah, I personally am not a big fan of gambling, and my voting record's been kind of anti-gaming. That said, I don't care if people go out and gamble, right? I'm not like, I don't have some sort of moralistic view of it. I think it's a terrible way to fund state government. The revenues that we take from that, the taxes the gaming facilities pay to us, are pretty regressive. You know, if you go into a casino, it's a lot of seniors, a lot of working people, and if you were to do an assessment of their incomes, you would find that it's mostly working people's levels of income. And sometimes people are there on their own free will, great. But when we look at funding basic services we all depend on, it seems like a pretty regressive, dumb way to do it. So that's probably my biggest objection to it, is it's kind of a tax on people that hurts working people.
In terms of economic development, I think the last number I saw was there are 234 areas bidding to be Amazon's second headquarters across the United States. What do you think of economic development like that, like Wisconsin doing everything it could to lure in Apple's and the others? I mean, do the states get their money's worth when they give all these great tax breaks to these companies to put factories and other facilities within their borders?
I think for the most part, states are getting ripped off, right? States have these programs to compete with one another for these jobs, and if all the states quit offering incentives, the question to the economy would be, would a business ever create another job, right? Because we've gotten to this place where it's almost a given that if a company wants to expand or a company wants to come to your state, you have to get the taxpayer's checkbook out and bribe them with a big contribution, right? Well, if none of us did that, do you think Amazon would not be opening another major facility? You know, businesses make decisions based on their ability to sell goods and services to people, not on whether they get a few cents on the dollar of their investment in some welfare check written to them by the state of Iowa or the state of Wisconsin. But that isn't the world we're in. So Iowa has a series of programs that offer incentives. In some cases, we've been way more generous than we need to be to get these companies. Again, businesses don't invest unless they've got more customers to sell stuff to, whether it's a pair of shoes or a haircut or a Happy Meal. You know, McDonald's is not going to put down a new McDonald's in some location if they don't think they're going to have customers. Well, Amazon isn't going to make a business decision about where they put a facility if it doesn't meet what their customers need. So the idea that this money somehow lures people here or there, these companies are playing states like you can't believe. They are in the driver's seat, and I wish we could get to a place where all the states said no more.
What about the economic multiplier theory, the cluster theory, where they think, you know, if Amazon comes in, hundreds of thousands of new jobs are going to grow up about it. There'll be a lot more small businesses. Children will see this. They'll want to do things they wouldn't do before. What have those played out for states?
I think, you know, sure, if whoever lands the Amazon deal, it's going to be, you know, whether there's a question if the state puts $3 billion into it, how long does it take for taxpayers to get a return on investment, right? Mm-hmm. Do they ever get it? But of course, there'll be some winners around the facility. The jobs created will be helpful to the people that get them, of course. But you know, at the end of the day, when the first job was created in the world, was it a tax credit that created that job, right? I mean, this idea that somehow nobody ever creates jobs unless taxpayers pony up. I mean, we're basically socializing capitalism when we're in a world where any business that starts a job expects you and I as taxpayers to shell over some money to them, like, thank you so much for creating a job. Businesses create jobs when they think they can make money, and that's the way things ought to work.
What about sort of the basic theory that, you know, Jeff Bezos did not get to be the world's richest man by being outmaneuvered by a state economic development agency? Have you ever pointed that out?
We just got kind of taken to the cleaners by Apple. We just gave Apple, the state just gave Apple $20 million. Apple's got more money than apples, right? I mean, they are rich, and billions. They're the top they have more money than any company that's ever lived on the face of the earth.
Or they're close to being worth $1 trillion in market capitalization.
And we're broke. The state of Iowa's budget is in crisis. We cut $30 million from the university, and we turned over here and said, here's 20 million, Apple, right? I mean, Apple, if you've been to an iPhone, one of the Apple stores, they're not giving away stuff. In fact,
I'm an adjunct. I can't afford an iPhone.
There's nothing's ever on sale, right? I mean, Apple they're ruthless. They're hardcore, and they took Governor Reynolds to the cleaners on that deal.
Now, you're going to go in session in about a month. What are the big issues waiting for you?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, the budget's kind of in crisis. The first thing we're going to do is have to cut some spending from the current year's budget because revenues are so lousy, and because tax credit spending has gone wild. It's the fastest growing part of our state budget. Over the course of the last year, where we've had to trim about $300 million in expenses out of the spending side and the appropriation side, we haven't asked for $1 of sacrifice from all these tax giveaways. And I hope that this next year we're going to see the Republicans some willingness to tackle some of that out of control spending that they say they care about, but rarely offer any kind of effort to trim it.
What is on your bucket list for this session, Senator?
Well, one of the bills that I've worked on the last couple of years is to try and end the suffering for thousands of Iowans who suffer from debilitating conditions. And this last year we passed a...
Is that rooting for Iowa State?
No. Well, yeah.
Hawkeye Nation.
Yeah, got you. Go Hawks. That's the area of medical cannabis. We passed a bill that's is not going to get the job done. So I hope to work on that in the 18th session. Maybe some tax policy work, and trying to stop bad things from happening for the most part. We had probably the worst legislative session in 50 years in 2017. Lots of really bad things done to working people So by the Republicans and the Republican governor. And of course, next year's an election year. We're going to elect a new governor and a new legislature, and so a lot of attention will be turned to the campaigns.
So the holiday season's upon us. What are your plans for that?
Take a little time off, get a little break, watch the Hawks, go to the bowls, or go to the bowl.
Happy holidays
Yeah,
to
thank
all
you.
from Iowa. Peace be with you from the 319. This is Jonathan Yates.